to a course in the book of Genesis. This course, in one form or another, has been going on since the mid-1990s and sponsored by 2 synagogues and 2 churches. And when the COVID struck, I was teaching at St. Johannes Church and St. Stephen's Church and Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, Reformed Jewish Temple, and Synagogue Emanu-El, conservative synagogue. And we put those 4 classes together on Zoom in April of 2020 and have been going strong since. We have something like, I think, close to 80 people enrolled in this class now who have re-enrolled, and that shows a great interest in studying the book of Genesis, which delights me, because the book of Genesis is, well, it's the book of the beginnings. It's the start of so much in our civilization. Our civilization, one used to be able to say, rests on the Greeks and the Hebrews. And an educated person in those days knew the Bible stories. I remember my mother's generation and grandmother's. They knew those stories. I don't think they knew the theological complications of them and how deep they ran and how great they are, because if they weren't, we wouldn't be talking about them 2,000 years later, and more than 2,000 years. So these stories go back, well, I would say about 3,000 years, some of them, but we're going to talk about authorship in a minute. So the Western civilization rests on the Hebrews and the Greeks. In some way, Christianity took from both and united them and conquered the West. And we are going to be dealing now with the Hebrew contribution that lies behind contemporary Judaism and Christianity and all of Western civilization. The last book we studied was the Gospel of Mark, the first gospel, the earliest gospel written, and around the various dates, 70 AD, something like that. And that's a formative gospel for Christianity. And Matthew and Luke, especially, are based on Mark with expanded material for their audiences. And then John is generally this similar story, but very different ideas about Jesus. So the gospel, to see the gospels grow from Mark in 70 AD to John in probably the early 2nd century, it's fascinating how Christianity develops and how the concept of who Jesus was expands. Same thing with the Hebrew scriptures. You have early sources and you have later sources. Now, with the Gospels in Christianity, you're dealing with within 1 century, late 1st century, early 2nd century. But here we're dealing with hundreds of years. The earliest strand of material in the book of Genesis is probably, some scholars date it back to 950 BCE. Others, 850. For a variety of reasons, I'd go with the 850 crowd, but when you look at an ancient text, how do you discover when it was written? How do you figure out who wrote it? How do you figure out who was the intended audience? That's crucial. And where it was written. You'll never hear this in church or temple. Even the traditional Jews who in the conservative and the Orthodox synagogues take an hour every Saturday morning to read a big chunk of the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Even they, the rabbi who will comment on the reading, typically you'll have about a half-hour reading of a big chunk of material, and then the rabbi in his sermon or commentary will explain various things. But they never ask who wrote it, where, why, who is the audience. It's just there. And the traditional attitude of Jews and Christians was, who wrote the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Moses. They're the 5 books of Moses. And Moses, if he wrote them, would have written them during the wanderings in the wilderness. If we date the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt at 1290 BCE, and there are reasons to do that, then between 1290 and 1250, the 40 years wandering in the wilderness, if in fact it was 40 years, that's when Moses would have had a chance to compose and write these books. The most Orthodox Jews believe that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he not only had the tablets of the 10 Commandments with him, he also had the 5 books. And he wrote them as an amanuensis, as a secretary for God, who uttered them during those 40 days and 40 nights on that fiery summit of Mount Sinai. Now, figuring out where Mount Sinai was, there are many theories there. But let's say that is a faith position. I don't say it's a bad position, but this course is taking into account the biblical scholarship of the last, well, going back to early 19th century. Scholars began to look at the Bible the way they had analyzed the Iliad and the Odyssey, also foundational documents of Western civilization, and to look at the Bible this way. Now, many people said this was a heresy. The Bible is a holy thing, touch it not. Analyze it not. It's a gift from God to us. Yes, they said they may be, but people wrote it. God didn't write it. I'm going to say something controversial. I've said it here before. The Bible, to me, is not the word of God. It's words about God written by prophets and sages. It begins in listen to what I mean. When in the beginning, God created the heaven and earth. That may be a proper translation of the first line. Debatable, we'll look at it. If in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, if it were the word of God direct, it would say, in the beginning, I created the heaven and the earth. If you want to hear the voice of God directly, read the Quran. When I started reading the Quran, and I'm no expert on Islam, but I looked at the Quran, I couldn't figure out who is the voice here, who's speaking. And I realized it's God. He's saying, I tell you this, I tell you that. You rarely find that in the Bible. In the Bible, the prophet is saying, the Lord said to me, or I felt that this is what he meant, and I'm passing it on to you. So it's the word of the prophet. God didn't write the book of Isaiah. Isaiah wrote it. Actually, a number of people under the name of Isaiah. Jeremiah didn't write the book. Jeremiah wrote the book of Jeremiah, not God. But he's telling you what he feels God wants us to know. So it's the book about God. And because it is, we have a lot more, because that's the way we look at it. Because we look at it if we look at it that way, we who are not church affiliated, I'm not speaking here for the churches and synagogues that are kind enough to sponsor this class. I'm trying to approach it from a scholarly point of view, as I did teaching at a state university for 42 years. And we had to be careful. We weren't preachers, we were teachers. And we asked basic questions, which aren't asked in churches and synagogues. Should they be asked? I don't know. Is there room? I mean, if you have a church service that's an hour, conservative synagogue service is 2.5 hours. It's hard for Christians to understand that Jews can sit there that long. And of course, Orthodox might be 3.5 hours on Saturday morning. There's so many prayers to say. After all these years, Jesus would recognize the prayers in the Orthodox synagogue or the conservative synagogue. That's just, he would say, but they've added so much. In Judaism, you never take anything away. You just keep adding and adding until you end up with a service that goes on and on. But there's so much to say that maybe that's why the rabbis and priests and ministers don't get around to analyzing the text the way you would analyze a regular book. Or maybe they don't want to. And maybe that would take the mystery away. I went to an Advent service. Happy Advent to everyone. It's 4 weeks before Christmas called Advent, the coming. In the Christian mind, Christ is coming closer and closer. And we began yesterday the magnificent service at Grace Church Cathedral, and it's all anticipation. On Jordan's bank, the Baptist cry announces that the Lord is nigh. Wonderful. And for 4 weeks, he's getting closer and closer. And then Christmas, of course, the magical moment and the birth of God into the human form. What a great idea. What a great idea. The union of the human and the divine. And that is the idea. You have it, of course, most dramatically in Christianity. Some in Hinduism too. In Judaism, you have a relationship between God and man that is very close, but it never quite becomes one. And the human is the human, the divine is divine, but they can come very close, but not quite merge. I mean, I spent my life analyzing Christian ideas and Jewish ideas and seeing where they're the same and where they differ. Fascinating. They all end up the same way, the love of God and your neighbor. That's what religion is. The rest of it is just illustration of that point. So, but when we look at the book of Genesis, who wrote it? When was it written? Why was it written? Who was the audience? There are many, many theories as to who wrote this material. And it's not just Genesis. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. Those books were written by a number of schools of writers. Now I'm sharing with you modern scholarship. And this is not what you hear in church. I warn that listen, it's a different thing. This isn't a church. This is a scholarly analysis of a text in front of us. The doubts about Moses having written the whole thing began to appear long, long ago when one commentator said, but the book of Deuteronomy ends with a description of the death of Moses. Moses wrote a description of his own death, and the Orthodox said, yes, with tears flowing down his face. But most people said, now, wait a minute. Somebody else must have written that part. So some of the traditional commentators said, all right. Moses wrote everything except the description of his own death. But that was the wedge in the door. And then they began questioning, why do you have two accounts of Noah's flood? In one, the animals go in 2 by 2. That's what we learn as children. And if you had, as I had, a little wooden model of the ark, you have Noah and Mrs. Noah, and you have all the animals, all the wooden animals. And Martha had 2 giraffes and had 2 cows, and it's great fun. But the next paragraph, it said of clean animals, whatever that may mean, they went in 7 by 7. There's a lot of animals in that boat. Unclean animals went in 2 by 2. Now, what do they mean? Kosher and non-kosher animals? There were 14 cows, but only 2 pigs? Probably they meant something earlier than that. Animals fit for sacrifice, and animals not fit for sacrifice. If this was written when the Jews were offering up animal sacrifice, then a cow was sacrificable. Another kind of animal was not. Maybe that's what they meant. But what does that have to do with Noah? Noah's flood is supposed to have happened, God knows how many thousands of years before Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the Israelites came on the scene. Well, according to it might not be that hundreds of years at least. So it's imposing the standards of the Jewish writer who wrote it, who believes there are some animals that are clean and some that are not, back on Noah, who wasn't even a Jew. There weren't any Israelites or Hebrews, later called Jews, until Abraham. And if you want a date for Abraham, 1800 BC, that's pretty good, because it says that Abraham lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, and then he moved from Ur to Haran, you have the Tigris and Euphrates. Promised land is over here, but he doesn't get there yet. He goes from Ur with his father up to Haran, and then we look at history and we see that Ur incurred a disaster at that time, and there was a mass migration. So Abraham's migration is just part of a mass movement across the Middle East. We're just concerned with Abraham and the details of his household. It's amazing. We're reading about the details of a man's household and his dealings with his wives that happened 3,000 years ago. Wow. Did this really happen? I don't know. But I know they're great stories. They might have happened just as it says. And they might have been, because of a universal message, they might have been brought into the modern age. Or they might have been made up. Or they might be like a novelist restating of some bare facts. How can we possibly figure out whether Abraham even lived in 1800 BC? And yet, as Christians and Jews, or just as inheritors of the Western story, the founder of monotheism, the belief in one God, a spiritual, unseen God who isn't made of wood or stone and isn't actually nature. That belief in such a God was such a powerful idea and a step forward, you might say, in civilization, that we're still with that God. The God of Abraham, in some ways, many ways, is the God that Jews and Christians still believe in. And you can imagine what a step that is to say. Now, who were pagans? Pagans weren't silly people, the way the Bible says they are. Every new religion has got a bad mouth the religion that came before. If paganism was good enough, then why did you need the Hebrew religion? If the Hebrew religion was good enough, why did you need the Christian religion? If the Catholic religion was good enough, why do you need the Protestants? If the Protestants are good enough, you wouldn't need the Mormons. So every religion, Mormons criticize Protestants, Protestants criticize Catholics, Catholics criticize Jews, Jews criticize pagans. And the picture of pagans in the Hebrew Bible is this. There's a song about them, how silly they are. A pagan goes out and he chops down a tree, cuts the log in half. Out of half the log, he makes kindling wood and he cooks his dinner on. The other half he turns into a statue and he sets it up. And he who just created the statue says, "Holy, holy, you created me. You're my creator, oh hunk of wood." No, they weren't that stupid. The Greeks and the Romans were not idiots. They believed in nature. Nature was divine. The earth was Mother Earth. We say it, but we don't really mean it. They meant it. Mother Earth, a goddess. The earth, it wasn't so much there was an earth goddess, the earth was a goddess. The sky, the high father of the sky, So you have father and mother, the mountain, the river, all gods. They worship nature. And that's not so stupid. We really are, even today, at the mercy of nature, hurricanes and floods and fires. Fire was a god, water was a god, earth was a god, air was a, that's what they believed. But the Hebrews came along, and the story tells us Abraham was the one to whom God came in the book of Genesis. And we will see this in chapter 12. The first 12 chapters, there are no Israelites. It's all about people like Noah and Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, who are the fathers and mothers of all humanity, according to the story. Then we'll see why God decided to choose Abraham and train him and his progeny so they would be his people and his witnesses in the world. And he makes this covenant with the people Israel, a two-way agreement. You let me be your God, and I'll be your God, and you will be my people. But no matter how often you and your weak human nature cause you to violate the covenant, I'll stick with you. From God's side, covenants are permanent. From man's side, from humanity's side, well, we make a lot of promises to each other, to other people, to God, to ourselves, and we break them because in a very interesting way, the self I am now is not the self I'm going to be in 5 minutes. Take an example. Man is an alcoholic. He gets up in the morning. Today, I will not drink. And he gets up, he goes to work, his breakfast, spends the day at the office. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock comes, he leaves. He walks past the bar. Can't resist. He's not the same person he was when he made the pledge. He is and he isn't. We have to reconstitute ourselves every moment because I can't trust myself to keep the pledge I make to myself within a certain number of hours or maybe even minutes. It's as if we make an appointment with ourselves at 5 p.m. And when we get there, we find we're not there. The self that made the appointment not to drink isn't there anymore. The self that gives in to the temptation, that's the self you find. So that's very mysterious in a sense. When I say I'm not the man I used to be, in order to say that, I have to, in some sense, be the man I used to be, but in a different form. There are many things at my age I cannot do when I was 20. When anybody says, "Oh, you look great," I think, no one ever said to a 20-year-old boy, he looks great. Of course he looks great, he's 20 years old. They say to some old wreck, "You look great," because, oh, it's amazing you're alive. So it's a compliment, but it's funny. So I'm not the man I was when I was 20. And yet to be able to say it in some sense, I am. This is a philosophy of self-identity and all this. I've got to renew my pledge every second. So if that's true, I break the covenant all the time. I'm not kind. I say nasty things. This is the weapon of my sin, not a gun, not a knife. What we don't say, all the compliments that would make somebody so happy. We think, "Gee, she looks beautiful tonight." For some reason, we don't say it. Say it. And I'm preaching to myself. Say it. People want compliments. Life is difficult. And we're here to help each other through it, for God's sake. That's why we're here. And the rabbis say, if you've done many good deeds, do not be proud of yourself, for this were you created. That's why we're here. But if you don't do the good deed that's called for, God holds you responsible, and you should hold yourself responsible. Why didn't I say that? And I could have said something that would have made him or her so happy. So every minute is a moment of choice. So if I'm like that, the people that God made a covenant with through Abraham and then renewed it, why do you have to renew it through Isaac, Abraham's son? Because it's another generation. The Jews don't say, we believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They say, we believe in the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Not because God has changed, but because the people have to renew that covenant from the human side in every generation. You know, it's only been 150 generations since Moses. Think of that. That's not that long. And here we are, still trying to work out a complex relationship with a God who somehow fell in love with Abraham as a son and sees in the face of every Israelite, that is, every Jew and every Christian, something of his beloved Abraham, because we're in the same tradition of Abraham. So the story, the book, the Bible, somebody says it's not a true book. Are these stories fact or fiction? I don't know, probably a mixture. But it is a book of truths. If these stories, every story in the Bible is true. Now that doesn't mean it happened. Truth and facticity are not the same thing. Every story is true because it tells a truth that we can gain something from. If it shows a story of somebody doing something evil, it makes it clear that's not acceptable. And the Bible is a finger pointing right out at us. You don't do that. Even Abraham sinned. There are no perfect people in the Bible. And if he sinned, how much more so do I have to be careful of falling short of what God expects of me? That's the value of these stories. They're true because they tell us truths about our life. You take the story, I'm just thinking of, it's Christmas is coming. The Holy Family, Joseph and Mary and Jesus in her womb, come to Bethlehem. There is no account in Roman records of a general taxation in that year in which everybody had to go back to their place of birth to pay taxes. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I don't care if the story ever happened. It doesn't matter. It's a great story and it's true. Whether it's fact or fiction, it's true. In the meaning that because it tells us truths about our lives. They get to Bethlehem, this sleepy little town where Joseph has to pay his taxes. And they go to the inn. No room. No room, says the proprietor. And in the story, of course, Mary is carrying the divine child. No room for God, no room. Too filled up with customers who are paying. God, no room. And he's born in a manger in a hillside and all that. That's a true story. Now, did that literally happen? I don't have the slightest idea. It doesn't matter. It's true because we have no room for God. And at Christmas especially, we're so busy, so many people are so busy shopping that they forget what the whole thing's about. If one goes to church every Sunday of Advent and sings those hymns, what is the hark of thrilling voices calling, Christ is near, it seems to say, cast away the works of darkness, O ye children of the day. What imagery. You go to church every Sunday and you throw yourself into that, waiting, the expectation is coming. Then you're not going to think Christmas is commercialized. You don't spend every weekend in department stores. you spend a little time with God. Your in isn't closed off to God when he knocks. I'm open here, come. The rabbis ask, why was the Torah, the Hebrew word for the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, why was it revealed out in the wilderness, Mount Sinai, and not in the Holy Land? Because the wilderness is ownerless and open. And when you go, some people pray like this, I'm open, God, come in. When you make yourself ownerless and open, God fills the gap, like he did with as he did with the wilderness and the revelation at Sinai. If you're all full up with yourself, you're never going to feel anything, no matter how often you go to church or synagogue. You have to open yourself. The Bible is trying to pry us open with these wonderful stories. So it began to, but who wrote it? First, everyone said Moses. Then in the 19th century, well, maybe not. I referred to 2 accounts of the flood story. Animals 2 by 2, the next paragraph 7 by 7. Could the same person have written both? Well, no, because in the 2 by 2 story, it refers to God by one name, and in the 7 by 7 story, in the next paragraph, it refers to God by another name. One we translate as Lord, one we translate as God. And people began to notice, these scholars, there are whole sections of the Bible in which God is called Lord. And those stories seem to be contiguous, but they're broken up. They were contiguous once. They're broken up by other stories in which God is called God. And the Lord stories seem to be much more intimate, often with a sexual aspect. I mean, they're about men and women getting together and having children and all. And the other stories where God is referred to as God, they're less intimate. They're more from a distance. Well, T.S. Eliot has a line, more distant than stars, but nearer than the eye. I think he's describing a dream. We all dream at night, and those visions are more distant than stars, yet they're right in here. Where are they? That out there? No, they're in here. More distant than stars, yet nearer than the eye. To me, that describes God. God is the creator of the universe, arranges the sky and the stars and their courses, the planets, and yet I feel him so deeply, so personally, way down inside. How God is in the depth and in the height. That's why the Bible stories, where do you find God? On mountaintops, in the height, the highest point of earth. Moses goes up, God comes down, and they meet between heaven and earth. Or sometimes you'll have a revelation of God in a cave. The cave represents the inner self. God within, to feel that intimate connection, the presence of God. Sometimes one can feel it physically. It's like a fullness in the chest, an overflowing vessel. My cup runneth over. More distant than stars, but nearer than the eye. This is a great mystery of the divine. But the Israelites came up with an idea, not that the sky was God, or the sun. Of course, in the Middle East, the sun is the dominant thing. You walk out into a desert, it's flat, and there's the sun, which gives you life or kills you, which God does. We had a funeral today. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The sun would be a very good representation for God, and the ancient pagans worshiped the sun. But the Israelites came along, Abraham, 1800 BC, we say, in the story. And God said to Abraham, chapter 12, verse 1, Now, what if you, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which we will read through, this is going to take time, we'll get through it. All of it's about the storybook parent of all of us. Jews, Christians, whoever we are, the unchurched. But the first Israelite or Hebrew, and he's called Habiru, a wanderer. Abraham's a wanderer. And God comes to him in chapter 12 and says, it's in poetry, Hebrew poetry. Lech lecha me artzecha me beit avicha. Get thee forth. Lech lecha. In modern English, we don't say that. Get thou out. Lech lecha me artzecha, from your house. Me beit, from your land, artzecha. From your father's house, beit avicha. Get out from where you are. Get out. Reach out. Transcend yourself. This is human nature. To reach beyond ourselves is to be ourselves. A person who doesn't reach beyond himself isn't really human. We reach beyond ourselves to touch other people, to intertwine our lives with theirs, to have projects in our lives, to build a business, to go out and have a career. Lech lecha, get thee out. Don't be comfortable where you are. Never be comfortable. Always have the next project over the horizon to make this world a better world. That's the way we act out our humanity. And that's how it begins. Get thee out of thy father's house and thy native land. Well, to what? And the rest of it says, and go to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great people. And in you shall all the peoples of the world be blessed. If you have the gumption to do the human thing and reach beyond yourself, says God, as I, God, am now reaching beyond myself to you, God has to transcend himself. He reaches out and creates the world. Could he have sat around doing nothing? Well, that would be boring even for God. So he reaches out, and here we are, because he reached beyond himself, but that is his nature. God has to be God of something, or he isn't God. Lord of something, creator of something. If there's no creation, there's no creator. If there's no world to be king of, he can't be king of the world. Everything we know about God, as I've said in this class many times, is his relation. Everything we call him, creator, sustainer, redeemer. Creator of whom? Of us. Sustainer of whom? Of us. Redeemer of whom? Of us. If there ain't no us, then God can't be creator, sustainer, and redeemer. My father and mother made me a son, but I made them parents. If there were no me, my father wouldn't be my father. I once said that to him at Thanksgiving after my first few weeks at college. I came home knowing everything, and he said, now I want you to do this. I said, I don't want to, but I'm your father. I said, well, I made you a father. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't be a father. What do you think of that? He hit me with a fork. We were at the table, very lightly, but he didn't like it. For this, you go to college. Yeah. The creation makes the creator a creator. The way the creator makes the creation a creation. Usually I use the example of a poet. What do you do, young man? I'm a poet. Show me some poems. I haven't written any. Then you're not a poet. The poet creates the poem, but the poem creates the poet. The creator creates the creation, but the creation creates the creator. God and his creation, they create each other. They are what they are only in relationship to each other. I'm a professor only because I'm recognized by students as such. They're the students because they're enrolled in my class and I recognize them as students. If there were not the mutual recognition, we wouldn't be who we are. Everything we are, like a husband and a wife, everything, son and a father, everything we are, it relates to others. We don't define ourselves on our own. As much as we would like to be the rugged individual, we rely on others to be what we are. Does God rely on us to be what he is? I think in some way he really does. He needs us, and we need him. We are the conscious part of the creation that can talk as we are now talking about God. As lovable as they are, pussycats and puppy dogs can't do that. The dogs think we're God. The cats, of course, think they're God. But we have an idea of the infinite, the eternal God. That makes us extremely special. And much is expected of us because this vision has been given to us. We have some quality of eternity within us, or else we couldn't conceive of the eternal, even in the very general way we do. But it said God breathed into Adam the breath of life, and God created man in his image. Now that's repeated in Genesis, and we'll get to that early, 3 times. And God created humanity in his image. In the image of God, he created humanity. Male and female, he created them. 3 times. The author of that must have thought it was plenty important. It may be the most important line in the Bible. We are the earthly images of God. Never say, I can't do that. What do you want from me? I'm just human. To be human is to be the earthly image of God. And we are to be the, what's the word I want? The guardians of this creation. He's given us power over the animals and over nature. We haven't done very well. He expects more. Responsible husbandry, that's what old-fashioned word. To care for something. And that's the job he gave us in creation. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and rule over all these species in a responsible way. And, well, we're at various tipping points in terms of climate, which indicate perhaps that we haven't done that very well. But that's our job, among other things. So back to the multiple authorship theory. You have to have 2 authors here who are both telling the story of the flood. One of them seems to say the flood is caused by improper sexual mixing between sons of God, whoever they were, some mythical being, and human women. And because of that improper mixing, the flood comes on to wipe everybody out. The other source, remember that source uses the word Lord and talks about animals 2 by 2. The other source, which uses the term God, talks about animals 7 and 7, and says it was violence. That's what caused the flood. Not improper sex, but violence. So here we have, that's everybody's favorite thing. It keeps every soap opera going, sex and violence. There's your half of your literature. And it's a matter of opinion. You got 2 writers. They have a tradition. They learned that there was an ancient flood that flooded the whole world, which for them meant the Mediterranean area, or maybe it was just the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was flooded. And on that, they based this great mythos, this great story. And by the way, in the study of religious literature, the term myth does not mean untrue. It means a story that expresses a larger than life truth, a truth that may approach eternal truth, if there is such a thing. So a myth, to say it's a myth is a compliment. A mythos in Greek simply means story. It doesn't say true story, false story. It's a story. And the Bible is a storybook. And our religions are stories. And we tell slightly different parallel stories. And we each have our holy books, which tell us about the early days and all that. So 2 authors. Let's say one is called the J author, which I'll explain in a minute. The other is the P author. J written about 850 BC, in my view. P about 550 BC. P for priestly, a group of priests wrote it. And each one had in their collective memory that there was a great flood, and they each told it separately. And in one tradition, there were animals 2 and 2, and one tradition, there are animals 7 and 7. And in one tradition, it said that sex caused the flood, and the other tradition said violence caused the flood. It is futile to ask which one is true in terms of which one really caused the flood. It's a matter of opinion. Bad things happen. What caused it? Did I do this? Did I do that? Did somebody else do it? Different people have different opinions. So, but you have two stories here. And when people began to say, we can't get around this, there are two accounts of the same event. Gee, there must be two authors here. Moses, or one man, wouldn't have written both. It's like in the New Testament, in Mark, Jesus virtually forbids divorce. He's against it. And a divorced person can't remarry. But in Matthew, on certain grounds, you can have a divorce and remarry. Jesus is quoted twice. Now, which one did he say? It's unlikely the same man gave two opinions on the issue. So he said one, and then the other one was tweaked. Or maybe he said neither, and both are just stories written by authors saying, well, Jesus would have said this. But he kind of said both. So, same thing here. The two different accounts, and that read it in the Hebrew, they're different Hebrew. Must be two different authors. And once they started on that, they said, but they're two different creation stories. The first story we're going to read is the 6-day story, written, we believe, by the priestly author, and I'll tell you next week, we'll get into why we call them what we call them. And that story is, God creates the world in 6 days, and it's perfect. After every day, he said, it is good. And after the 6 days, he said, it is very good. And then he rested from all his work. Strange notion that God works and then has to rest. Well, it's a very human God, and we find in the Bible. It reflects our nature in many ways, just better. You might say, God is us, only more so. And there's a humanity in God which is quite touching. He can be hurt. He didn't bring the flood because of anger. He brought it because of pain. The Lord repented that he made man. If I had known how corrupt he was going to be, I wouldn't have started with these human beings. Did God make a mistake? I was talking about human beings reconsidering what they say. Does God sometimes have to do that? Does God know the future? Did God know that human beings at the age of Noah would be so corrupt, he thought, I'm going to wipe them out and start again? Did he know that in advance? You see, these are the questions you never hear in church and temples. It's very interesting. This is theology. Theology is called theologo. Theo, God, logo, to talk, God talk. Theology is reason speculating on the nature of God, faith-seeking understanding, somebody said, and asking wonderful questions about what does this story in the Bible that says God repented, he made man, what does that tell us about God? Can he change his mind? Can he be taken by surprise? Does God know the future? Can anyone know the future? Does the future even exist? That God could know it? The past was real once. Now it's just memory. The present is real at this second, and now it's gone. But the future, where is it? A little bit of philosophy of time. After this class, I will go into the next room, my living room, and there I will sit down and finish the New York Times. And there's a yellow chair there. that chair will be waiting for me. But suppose I go in there at 9 o'clock. Is 9 o'clock waiting for me? Is 9 o'clock out there somewhere like the chair waiting for me? No. 9 o'clock does not exist yet. And when 9 p.m. exists, it'll exist for an instant and then it'll be gone. I can know the chair is there unless somebody comes and burns it or steals it. But I can't know the instant I'm going to get out there because it's not out. There is no thing to know. 9 o'clock does not exist yet. Can God can know everything that exists. But if time doesn't exist, if the future doesn't exist, even God may not know. Might be surprised by it. And so be surprised by Noah's generation. It's just speculation. Or if God is above the flow of time and space and sees everything from another dimension, then he sees everything at once and there is no future for him. So he sees everything, he knows everything. But so the question is, does God know the future? I've had many fascinating classes on this issue. And the Bible sometimes says yes, and sometimes says, oh, well, he seemed to be taken by surprise by Noah's generation, so let's discuss this. Endlessly fascinating discussions come from the Bible. So now we're taking two creation stories. We saw two flood stories. What's the second creation story? Adam and Eve. In the first story, what is the first command? The 6-day story. You open the Bible and you have the 6-day creation story. Everything's great and everything's very good and God is thrilled and man is here and woman is here. And the very first commandment is Peru Urvu, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In other words, go off and have sex. He does everything but supply the bed. It's wonderful. That's how you have children. There's nothing wrong with the body. It doesn't say the soul is good and the body's bad, or this earth that is so glorious, this wonder beyond words that surrounds us. To see it, to hear, to touch, to smell, to taste, this beautiful world. Nowhere is it said evil in that 6-day story. Everything's good. There is no evil. And they go off and do what they have to do to be fruitful and multiply, and God is delighted. The end. And then you find in chapter 2 of Genesis a new beginning. Just as it said in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth in the 6-day story. Now it says one day, in the day that the Lord God made the heaven and the earth. Now the word Lord is inserted, different author. In the day the Lord God made the earth and the heaven. It reverses it because it's going to be an earth-centered story. This is the J writer telling us an intimate story about God and Adam and Eve, his children. And it looks like it's when they discover their own sexuality and perhaps even act on it without consulting him, that God is enraged. The very thing that God in the 6-day story told them to do, when they discover it by eating the tree of knowledge, he is enraged. It's a different story. And he cast them out of the Garden of Eden. And we'll study in detail, what does that tree of knowledge mean? The knowledge of good and evil. What does it mean to know it? What did God not want us to know and not want us to do? What exactly does that tree represent? A very complicated issue. It's where history somehow went wrong. How did it go? How does it go wrong for every one of us? Because every one of us knows thou shalt not eat of that particular tree, whatever tree it is in our life. And everyone is fascinated, and very often we eat of the tree. In other words, we know what not to do, and just because we are, we do it. A lot of trees in that garden. God points out to Adam, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, But of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, the tree of good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil, thou mayest not eat. For in the day thou eatest thereof, thou shalt be mut yamut, sentenced to death. Maybe not immediate death, but eventual. Adam and Eve were supposed to be immortals. In the midst of the garden, there's also a tree of life. There are two trees, which leads me to think maybe they're two stories put together. Eventually, they're going to be allowed to eat of the tree of life, which is immortality, because they obey God. But then they eat of the tree, which God says, don't eat of it. Good, the knowledge of good and evil, they knew what good was. Good was to obey God, and evil was to disobey God. It's not our business to make ethics. That's God's business. It's our business to carry it out. I don't determine whether I should treat my brother or sister with kindness. God says, do it. That's my rule, and we are supposed to carry it out. Adam and Eve had good and evil sufficient for their purpose. Obey God good, disobey God bad. But they wanted to define good and evil on their own. And so they ate of that tree, which that's what it was. Moral self-sufficiency. And don't mind what the other old one says. We'll be God. We'll define good and evil. And that was the sin, I think. And also, it seems to give, they knew that they were naked. Now, infants are bathed together, they're naked, but there comes a time when you don't bathe the little boy and little girl together, because there's an aspect to nudity with sexual development and sexual self-consciousness is no longer appropriate. Adam and Eve moved from sexual innocence to sexual experience. That's part of what this story is about, just growing up. And that causes great anxiety for parents, God in this case. So there's a whole Freudian analysis of this story about sexuality and what it does for the children as it begins to emerge. No, there's no secret why kids, when they're adolescents, are fighting with their parents. I want to be a person. I called my college students Mr. Jones and Miss Smith, never by their first name. They're struggling to be their own persons, adults, and I'm going to help them to do that by addressing them as adults. And they would say call me Harry. No, you're Mr. Jones. And you're going to call me Professor or Dr. Kogan. And now I live in a world where people call me and say, hello, is this who are you? Have we met? No, Michael. Then don't call me Michael. My friends call me Michael. Call me Dr. Kogan. And they don't know what to do. They get all confused. And then I spent a month in Los Angeles where they don't even know last names out there. Waiters come over and say, hi, Mike, happy you made the reservation. What's going on here? Well, I guess I'm old-fashioned. But back to the story. So they discover their own sexuality. I can be a mommy. I can be a daddy. I don't have to do what daddy and mommy say anymore. And then there's great tension in the house and all kinds of lots of love, but also lots of tension because the children want to be adults and the adults think they're still children. And but there are problems in this world, and they are reflected in the Adam and Eve story, which is, lo and behold, is the second creation story. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. So we're going to talk about the earth. And then Adam and Eve is part of that. And he doesn't think everything is good. Adam and Eve screw up. Everything's bad. So is life basically good or bad? Are people basically good or bad? The Bible, in one story, it seems to say they get up to all kinds of mischief. Got to watch them. In the other story, they're innocent and pure. Two views. Are children born good? Are they born a tabula rasa, a blank slate, neither good nor bad, and given free will to make decisions morally, or are they born with original sin, as St. Paul would say? We inherit the sin of Adam. Some Christians don't believe that. Judaism doesn't believe in original sin. So it's a theoretical argument. If Christ redeems us in Christianity, a Jewish observer would say, well, but from what? And if you say from the inherited sin of Adam, the Jewish observer would say, but in my religion, we don't believe that we inherit Adam's sin. Therefore, what Christ comes to do so crucially in Christianity, if you believe in original sin, it would be superfluous in Judaism. He's doing something which isn't needed because we don't suffer for original sin. Well, do we or don't we? I don't know. But you have two ancient great traditions, and they differ on this. In my book, which is called Opening the Covenant, A Jewish Theology of Christianity, I say that's the difference between Pauline, the Christianity that St. Paul really founded in his letters, that in Adam, who sinned, sin spread from him to the earth. Cursed be the earth because of you, said God. And sin and death spread everywhere. And we're all cursed. And Paul says, the sin I would do, I do not, the good I would do, I do not do. The evil I would not do, that I do. Wretched man that I am, who will save me from this living death? And then he says, thanks be to God for Christ our Lord. I have a tendency towards sin, which I inherit from Adam, and there's no way I can get over that. Therefore, and everything was affected by sin. The whole world is corrupt. Paul quotes the Hebrew Bible saying, God looked down from heaven looking for a righteous man, and he found no righteous, no, not one. That line seemed to agree with Paul. But there was one who wasn't affected by the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, and that is God. So he becomes man and comes down and pays the price for our sin. We should die. But Jesus, who's an immortal, remember, he didn't have to die. He chooses crucifixion to die in place of us. That's the great Christian story. God so loved the world that he took on the punishment we deserve. And a quick way of understanding it for viewers who aren't familiar with it is Christmas comes, or Hanukkah, whatever you're celebrating, or both. That's best for children. Celebrate them all. And more presents, the better. You give your son a ball and bat. He goes out to the street. He hits that ball right through the $10,000 plate glass window of your neighbor. And the neighbor comes over with a bill for $10,000. He doesn't give it to your 12-year-old son. He doesn't have $10,000. He gives it to you, who haven't done anything. But you, as a loving father, you pay your son's debt. Simple. That's what God does by becoming man and dying for us. Now we can live forever with God if we accept what he has done for us. We have to accept it. All right, that's the Christian story encapsulated according to St. Paul. And the Jewish story is, yes, Adam and Eve sinned. They gave us a bad example. But that doesn't mean that I'm born in sin. I didn't inherit the sin of Adam. And children are good. The world is good. It isn't cursed at all. It's for us to build the kingdom of God. So if I were to sum up, and sometimes people corner me when I give a speech, how would you sum up Christianity? Fall and redemption. In Adam, everything falls into death and sin. In Christ, the second Adam, everything's redeemed. That's Pauline Christianity, coming from St. Paul. There are other versions. That seems to be dominant. How would I sum up Judaism? Building the kingdom of God on earth. The soil is there, it's good. Build on it. There is no original sin. In Jewish religion, the word world is never used in a negative way. It's a good place. And it never was polluted by sin. It just is what it is, and we make it good or bad depending on our choices. Different views. Is one true and one false? No, both are very revelatory of how human beings, intelligent people, strive to figure out what the hell is going on with human life. Are we good? Are we bad? Do we have free will? Another question. The Bible assumes we have free will. But the problem is I did not choose to be born a male or Jewish or white or an American or any of this. That's given. But within those parameters, I still can make moral choices. So we have destiny and freedom. And they don't always get along. How come, is there destiny? Or do I make my own destiny? Remember Lawrence of Arabia, the Arabs always say, it is written. He said, nothing is written. From the Western point of view, it's for us to build our own lives. And there are many Christian theories that say, no, we don't agree with Paul. Christ did not necessarily come to pay off our sins. God became man and lived among us to show how much he loved us and wanted to share our lives. A friend of mine is of the Franciscan order of priests. And he said, I don't go for that Paul stuff. It's not a formula where Adam sins, the first Adam, then Christ is the second Adam, and he gets this out of it and pays the price. Too formulaic. God became man in order to show how much he loved us and wanted to live with us and affirm the goodness of life on earth. Now, there's a theory of the incarnation of God becoming man, which has nothing to do with Paul. So you can't sum up any of these religions and say, they say that. We have Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, and other kinds. We have Presbyterianism, and we have Unitarianism, we have Episcopalianism, we have Catholicism. Each one, they're different. And they have different insight. When they read the Bible with different assumptions. But the scholarly point of view is something else again, which will dominate in this course. Who wrote? There are many authors. For the little evidence I've given you, there's much more. Many groups of writers wrote the Torah, which is the first 5 books, allegedly of Moses. We will be going into that in detail next week. There's a whole handout thing that Joe sent you, Joe Stern, without whom none of this could happen, and I thank him, because I know nothing about computers. All I know about is how to talk. It's computers, how to turn them on, how to access them. He is our genius, our webmaster. And look at this. But I wrote these pages, pretty good in my opinion, 8 pages of handout on one theory of who wrote what in the Torah. There are many, many theories extant today. What I have here is called the documentary hypothesis. Mid-19th century and dominated until the mid-20th century, when I was being schooled, that there are 4 basic authors of the Torah. Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 5 books of Moses, the Torah. That means in Hebrew, it's the teaching. No, Moses didn't write it. He may have written the 10 Commandments. The rest of it's written by 4 different schools of writers from 800 or 900 BCE and all the way up, possibly to 500 BCE. They're called J, E, D, and P. And we will talk about them in detail next week. And if you can look over this material, it'll be very helpful to you because you'll know what I'm talking about before I'm talking about it, or as I talk about it, you can follow along when I say page 2, section 3, and that kind of thing. It's much more helpful if you have the outline in front of you. If you have a printer, if not, have a friend who has a printer, print it out for you and have it in front of you next week. It'll help. But if whether or not, we will continue to discuss the authorship issue. And I am consciously and awarely passing on to you a theory that many people today disagree with, but that I haven't seen any alternate comprehensive theory that deals with who wrote this collection of books. Remember, the Bible is not a book, it's a library of books. Within it, you have the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Then there's so many new theories that we'd have to spend, and friends of mine have taught courses on just the authorship question, but we're not going to spend a year on that. I want to get into your head one theory that is one way of dealing with it, which I think is so far the simplest to grasp, and yet has much accuracy in it. Doesn't mean it's the last word. There's always someone's going to come along and say, but a book was written last week by a scholar proving the Bible was written by one man. I mean, the Torah. There is such a scholar out there. We're going back to Mosaic authorship now, and what's happening? But they don't back the theories up. This one seems to me, for a class like this, easy to grasp, and there's much truth in it. So that's what we're going to be talking about. J, E, D, and P, the 4 documents go together to produce the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And I think it's a helpful theory. And we started to talk about that there are 2 creation stories, one by the J author, one by the P author. There are 2 flood stories, one by the J, one by the P. Then there's an E source, shorter, but he throws his stories in. Then there's D, which is responsible for the book of Deuteronomy, hence D. We're not going to get into him because we're not dealing with the book of Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomy is this collection of speeches by Moses, allegedly, which in fact was written much later, 600 years after Moses, probably. And it's like saying Abraham Lincoln gave this speech and Abraham Lincoln gave that speech, and then we find out that it's what somebody in 1930 thought Abraham Lincoln would have said if he gave that speech. And that's what you have in Deuteronomy, probably written about 600 BC, but purporting to be Moses in 1200 BC. And fascinating speeches, but for a variety of reasons, not likely to have been written by Moses. Many of the books in the Bible are pseudonymous, meaning they're named for people who didn't actually write them. And that they do that in order to give them power and strength to persuade the reader. So if you say 5 books are written by Moses, and for the Jews, Moses is the greatest prophet. Lo kam b'Yisrael Moshe, no, there's never arisen a prophet like Moses. Well, you're going to pay attention to that writing. If you take a book about Jesus and ascribe it to Matthew, the disciple, whether Matthew ever wrote it, it gives it authority, and people will take it seriously, more so than you say, well, it's an unknown book about Jesus. We don't know who wrote it, which is the fact. It wasn't attributed to Matthew until the 2nd century. We don't know really who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Somebody who knew the Hebrew Bible very well and believed Jesus was a Jewish Messiah, but we're not sure who that was. It was some very learned man. But scholars today doubt it was actually Matthew, Jesus' buddy, one of the 12 disciples. So this happens all the time in ancient literature. Who wrote what? We'll explore that question next week. And who was the audience for these different writers? And where were they written? And why were they written? I find these issues fascinating, but you're never going to hear them in church or synagogue, which is why we have classes like this. Welcome. And if there are any, Joe, if there are any people with urgent questions that sent them to you or comments you think I should explore, for a few minutes, I'm happy to do that.
Does anybody have any questions? You can unmute and ask.
All right. Well, I'm glad you came. We have what, about 75 or 80 people signed up here, which is amazing.
Yep, we had 37 tonight, so pretty
And
good.
wonderful turnout. And I mean, you come as you can. You're free on a Monday night, come and spend an hour with us. If you can come every Monday, even better. But it's not the kind of thing where someone takes attendance. We're happy to have you whenever you come. And we're just going to go through Genesis story by story, sometimes line by line. And it may very well take a year. And it'll be a year well spent. No rush. I don't have any dean telling me I have to do it in one semester. President of the college, you've got to get through this. When I taught in university, I taught 2 semesters of New Old Testament and 2 semesters of New, 2 of Hebrew Bible, 2 of Christian. And there was a certain amount of leisure there. But of course, even that's not enough. But right now, I have no limit. We can spend a year on Genesis. And it's all right with me. I love the story. You know, there's a hymn, I love to tell the story. It will be my theme and glory to tell the old story. And that's the old story on which Western civilization rests. And you can't tell it too often or get every time I do it. For 50 years now, there are new insights. Because I'm reading on the side all the time. What did he have to say about it? What did he have to say about it? Well, I'll share that with the class. No, that's silly, but that's a good insight. So it's always new. Great literature is always new every time you read it. I was watching television the other night and I saw Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Brutus and Cassius and the murder of Caesar. The music, the words are like music. Shakespeare is so great. You're exalted by the words. What is the meat? On what meat does this our Caesar feed? Every sentence, superb. And it's just such a joy. And these the ancient Greek plays, Plato and Aristotle, the Bible, Shakespeare, this is our civilization. And I think we should keep up with it by reading these classics over and over again. And the Bible certainly is maybe the most important. And it may be that Genesis is the most important book ever written because it really outlines how one should live and think, if possible, and do and act. That's the most important thing. Toward each other. And the terrible things people do to each other. Brother kills brother. Cain kills Abel. In the whole world, there are 4 people. Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel, and one of them becomes a murderer. That doesn't bode very well for the future. And it's his brother. And what's the message among so many? Every homicide is a fratricide. We're all brothers and sisters, all of us. Be kind. Be compassionate. Be caring. However angry you get at your brother, work it out. And that's true of everybody. If people are mean and nasty, it's because they're unhappy. And that's what that great Hebrew story tells us. Cain felt that Daddy Adam favored his brother, and God favored his brother. And when a disfavored sibling is so hurt and receives what Freud called a narcissistic injury to his very sense of self, he lashes out and he kills his innocent brother. It wasn't Abel's fault that he was the favorite of God. He should have said, why did God favor Abel over Cain? There are reasons, but Cain wasn't interested. He just lashed out. So that lesson is an eternal lesson for us. And the Old Testament and the New Testament both are filled with stories like this. And I think having taught the book of Mark, the first gospel. When you open the New Testament, you first see Matthew, but Mark was written before Matthew, about 70 AD, as I said. And there's stories in there which also give us these eternal truths about how to treat each other and not turn on each other. Why did Jesus believed, as people in those days believed, that people were possessed by demons if they had epilepsy or mental illness or whatever. And he drove those demons out of people. Now, for years I taught, well, that was the belief of that time. We today don't believe in demons. There are ways of treating diseases, mental diseases. And but Jesus was a man of his time, and what can you expect? I know better now. What is the reason for he said, it's the demon in the person that's bad, not the person. When Jesus does his first miracle, a man is possessed and he comes close and the man cries out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus, Son of the Most High?" But that's not the man talking, that's the demon in him, a supernatural being who knows that Jesus is special. And Jesus says, "Be silent and come out of him." And the demon, the poor man is writhing, the demon doesn't want to come out, and the demon, by the power of Jesus' word, is forced out. Oh, what a story. But what's behind it? Jesus had the gift to look beyond what a person said and beyond what a person did to that person, to what the person was. And he said, it's not you, it's the demon in you that's making you so mean and nasty. When you're in a room with a nasty person that's unpleasant, it'd be much more unpleasant to be that person. People are mean and nasty because they're unhappy. And they're possessed by a demon. And we can get beyond that demon. I'm speaking metaphorically, obviously, by being kind and reaching out beyond the demonic, beyond the nastiness or the cruelty of the person, and try to touch their soul and say, I care about you. You're not bad. You don't mean those things. You'd be surprised how often that works. That beneath the bad deed and the ugly words is a suffering human being. And that's what that demon stuff is all about. So although today we don't literally believe in demons, metaphorically, Jesus had a point. It's not the person that's bad, it's the demonic in him or her. Get it out, be kind, reach beyond, say, I care for you, I value you. And I have had the experience that it really makes a difference. Sometimes it works. So that's the great truth of that demonic stuff in the New Testament, I think. And the great truth in the Old Testament story of Cain and Abel. Don't kill your brother. Find out what makes him tick. And be kind. That may be the great commandment, in my view. Be kind. You can't say it too often. Okay, folks. It's been a pleasure. And thank you, Joe Stern, as always. And we'll be back next week, and we'll get, if you get this, you have this stuff from Joe, if you can print it and look it over, the JEDP theory, the documentary theory, will discuss the authorship and the time when the books were written and all that. And then eventually we'll actually open the Bible and get into the text together. God bless, happy holidays, and I'll see you next Monday evening.
Thank you, Michael. It was wonderful being with you.
Always a pleasure.